Nice warm welcome to our panelists this morning. Nice to see you all. To kind of give a sense of some drama that we had in the scene, His Excellency, who I've known for, I think, 15 years, went to the St. Regis on the Corniche. But since we had a nice fireside chat with His Excellency Abdullah bin Tuk and Anthony Scaramucci, there was no pressure getting here. It's good to see everyone. I thought that opening session and the discussion about the cluster approach to the UAE economies very apropos for our discussion today. We're going to landscape the geoeconomic and geopolitical challenges of today, but also look at where the UAE fits in that global mapping. I think if you look at the CEPA agreements that His Excellency Abdullah bin Tuk talked about here, it gives you a sense of how they see the vision for growth over the next 50 years. As a visiting professor at NYU Abu Dhabi, I designed a course to look at the Gulf economies through the prism of the UAE. So the first 50 years, trade, finance, energy, and tourism. But what does the next 50 years look like? And you can see the drive towards the data economy as well as some of the issues that the Minister of Economy brought up. I'd like to start with you, Dr. Mohadeen. In your role both in the World Bank before as the Minister of Investment in Egypt and now at the International Monetary Fund. We're mapping the world today, and you have some concern about the middle-income economies, middle-income or SMEs, medium-sized companies taking the squeeze right now. I think the global economy has been incredibly resilient, which we'll talk with Nathan about in just a moment. But what is your concern when it comes to the middle-income economies right now and the squeeze that they're facing in this transition after a pandemic shock, supply chains, inflation, and then this transition to a new era of growth?
Thank you so much. Let me first thank the organizers, His Excellency, and the great hospitality of the UAE. It's, I think, my third time since the start of the year being here between Dubai and Abu Dhabi, flying from Washington or from elsewhere. Lots of activities, including the big trade forum and events, the ministerial meetings. You encouraged me to talk about something different. And everybody's talking about soft landing, about the economic recovery, about inflation is almost beaten by monetary policy. Growth is about 3 to 3.1% for this year, around 3.2 to 3.3 next year. Some people are celebrating this because we had seen worse years during the last few years since the decade. But I like to talk about the missing middle, not just the middle-income countries, but the middle class, and the medium-sized enterprises, not the small, medium, and micro enterprises, but the middle enterprises in particular. And the issue here is basically that they are not on the map when it comes to the attention required for the majority of the people who live in middle-income countries. We have Professor Bourguignon here, and he knows, like many, that the majority of the poor are in the middle-income countries. Africa today, a great continent with many opportunities, is not a continent of low-income countries anymore. It's a continent of middle-income countries. Middle class have been squeezed, not just in some developing economies and emerging markets like mine, but in some advanced economies. And this very much have been behind the tension, the frustration of middle class of yesterday and today, concerned about the future of their children. And that's why you see a lot of interesting dynamics in politics. So this is about the middle class. And when it comes to medium enterprise, if you are a micro enterprise, if you are a startup, if you are a very large corporation, you have your access to credit or subsidized credit if you are a smaller one. But middle size in developing economies do not have that kind of support. And here I think, being in dystopia, following the great work and following as well the discussion in the first session, I would say, well, the solution should be in investments. Investments in human capital, health and education, investment in infrastructure, including digital infrastructure and AI, investment in resilience, including dealing with climate change and investments when it comes to resilience and dealing with adaptation needs. But my concern is that this is not really being discussed. I'm following closely the G20 meetings now in Brazil. There are ministerial meetings happening there. The attention is being given to the advanced economies and the emerging markets of the G20, while the rest of us are not really put in the priority list of actions. Biggest concerns are the following. Debt is still overwhelming, and the magnitude of debt in many developing economies and emerging markets is not going to be strong enough to cause something similar to the global financial crisis, but is going to be causing not a financial crisis of a global nature, but a global development crisis, with implications on trade, with implications on opportunities for investment, and that wild card of forced migration. So I think the common sense approach here, Minister spoke about abundance in giving. I would say as well, I would complement what he said, abundance on thought as well, that we need to bring to the attention that this world is complicated. It's not just about the G20. It's not just about some rich countries. It's basically about the majority. And actually, there are opportunities, not just challenges, if we are doing the right thing by highlighting the needs and the opportunities for those who are in the middle. Countries, companies, or firms, and of course, the middle class.
Yeah, and there's some of those countries that are taking a squeeze. I'll circle back with you to talk about even Egypt, the move by the UAE. In fact, there was a great deal of concern. I was just in Cairo 10 days ago, but I'll come back to you on that. One of the points I was making in my opening remarks there, albeit brief, Nathan, is the resilience of the global economy. We had a pandemic. Supply chains were broken. Inflation like we haven't seen in 40 years, as Dr. Mohideen was saying, is coming down. And then we're making this transition of China not growing very fast, the U.S. having a solid recovery. Are you most impressed by the resilience? And I think we have some differing opinions here on the recovery itself. You're actually pretty bullish right now in terms of that resilience and what it means for growth.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be with you this morning. And I really do think that it is helpful for us to frame a lot of our discussions of concerns and risks and so on and so forth with the observation that over the last 4 years, we have seen an extraordinarily resilient global economy. You know, if you had tackled me in February of 2020, and said, we're going to have a global pandemic, we're going to have lockdowns, supply chain disruptions, a war in Ukraine, surging inflation, the most aggressive central bank hiking cycle in a generation. And then for good measure, last year we saw some disruptions in the global banking system and the onset of tensions in the Middle East. And then asked me to guess where the global economy would be, would have debated whether I should say severe recession or depression. And the reality is, and it's typified by performance last year, the global economy last year grew at by our reckoning, grew at a 2.7% pace versus a 3% estimate of global trend growth. We're a little different in our estimate of global trend due to some weighting issues, but just a little bit below trend. And I think it behooves us all to step back and say, what are the big themes and stories here? And I think one of the big drivers of this is technology and the flexibility in communications and operations that has imparted to the business sector. So I think that this positive driving force of resilience is really critical, and it's something that I'm expecting to continue going forward. Now, that said, even a resilient global economy is going to be subject to some cycles, and we do think that there's still some lagged monetary policy tightening that's in the pipeline. We think the global consumer is likely to take a breather. Labor markets ease up a bit, so we may see some cyclical slowing in the United States and the global economy more broadly. But it's in the context of this ongoing march of productivity, of technology, and of flexibility. And if there is an advantage, and I think you mentioned this, John, to the slowing that we're expecting, it should open the door for services inflation more broadly to come off, and central banks to be vigorously cutting rates by the second half of this year.
Good. You brought up services. We have an agreement very early at MC13 on services, which has been a struggle.
Yes, sir.
So in the position what the Minister of Economy was talking about here, the UAE is a globalized economy. It's just hosting that movement into services and in fisheries. It brings up, Francois, if I can, globalization, because we had a burst of it with China coming onto the scenes, India next major growth driver, the CEPA agreements that the UAE's laid out. You can just look at the 26 countries and say opportunities for growth. But on your radar, we come out of COP28 and the responsibility for governments to help drive policy. There's a different China. It's not a fast-growing China anymore. It's a mature economy. What's it look like? And then we've been enjoying the benefits of globalization, high productivity, but that's not easy to sustain. So what's the counter-argument, if you will, of what Nathan laid out for us on the outlook?
Okay, thank you very much for this. Yes, I mean, I'm not sure that I'm as optimistic as Nathan just expressed his views. I think that we have to make a distinction between what is a medium and long-run potential growth rate in the global economy and what is going on today or what has been going on over the last couple of years. Yes, there has been resilience, fantastic, but resilience was essentially the product of huge interventions of states everywhere in the world. And to some extent, we could say that if tomorrow there would be another shock of the same magnitude of the one that we have seen in the past, maybe we would not have as many ammunitions than we had in the past. So I have no doubt about the fact that we did rather well given the circumstances. But my point is to say that when we look at the longer run, then we have to ask ourselves, where is the global engine of growth? And for a while, we know that the global engine of growth was globalization. And by globalization, it was the big shift of a lot of activities from the global north to the global south. Global south, as a matter of fact, being very much China in those days. Now, this was a very, very powerful force for global growth. This has been done. It may be the case that now some manufacturing activity will go from China to other countries. Fine, but the basic element, the basic force toward a higher level of productivity in the world is already there. I mean, we will not get it back. We will not get it another time. And this is the reason why I believe that in the medium and long run, the global growth will most certainly be not as fast as what we have seen in the quote-unquote glorious days of globalization. Many people will be against saying glorious days for globalization. But in purely economic terms, I believe that we can say that. Now, I hope that I will have the opportunity to come back on another element, which is, I believe, the most important, especially talking in the country which hosted the COP28 a few months ago, that we have to talk about climate change.
Okay, let's pick it up. We only have 15 minutes left, so I'm going to ask for great focus. You can pick up off of each other to pick up on and refine some of the points. I'm going to come back to globalization, but let's drill in on COP28. You were instrumental in COP27, and now we have a troika structure, which I actually think was genius, to have what was developed at Sharm el-Sheikh, what was agreed here as a consensus, and carry that to Azerbaijan at COP29. Francois' view is that it can be a burden because we're asking for better than $4.3 trillion a year for the transition. Those middle-income countries and the least developed economies are struggling to raise money. do you want to jump in on this? And again, please be cognizant of time.
First of all, it was great that two countries in our region, Egypt and then the UAE, hosting COP27 and COP28. And both of them were game changers in the way that the whole climate agenda had been handled. From this kind of silly reductionist approach that was used in the past into a more holistic approach, focusing on investment in opportunities, linking climate finance to development. For the first time since the Paris Agreement in 2015, the opportunities for adaptation and biodiversity as investment opportunities were laid out. The other thing, we didn't just stop in the two COPs, and especially in COP28, by talking about investments and gaps. We know that there is $2.4 trillion of gaps that should be bridged. That the gap should be bridged as follows. $1 trillion from abroad, from external sources. This is just for developing economies and emerging markets, excluding China. The $1 trillion should come from doubling bilateral finance, tripling finance coming from the MDBs, and getting private sector finance to be quadrupled. In addition to that, there should be domestic resource mobilization shifts towards investments in resilience at large. But there was a good opportunity as well in the UAE by unleashing the potential of the private sector and philanthropies by announcing the Altera fund for $30 billion, aiming to $250 billion, with a portion dedicated for capacity development, technical assistance, knowledge transfer, and technology transfer. So there were better approaches.
Very specific approaches, right?
Very specific approach, comprehensive, practical, and designed for opportunities, not just bragging about the problems. But going back to the original issue of concern, which is basic, can we do it in such fragmentation? There is a very big debate whether the fragmented global economy, is it because of the trade restrictions? 3,000 trade restrictions were imposed last year, 3 times more than what we had before the pandemic in 2019. Great that we are hosting here the big forum on trade, but we need to see some measures in order to make sure that trade is flowing back, investment is flowing back, and debt crisis or crises scattered in developing economies are going to be tackled. More than that, it's not just about the trade restrictions, it's the tension when it comes to geopolitics. And here it's not just about talking economy and trade opportunities, but I think there is an issue that the Secretary General of the UN, whom I have the pleasure of advising him on finance for development, he has been warning everybody about the deficit in trust and the unhealthy competition that is very much responsible for lots of matters of impact, not just between the rivals, the incumbent powers and the rising powers, but many of those who are stuck in the middle again.
Okay, it's interesting you circle back to the middle. We should try to raise the geopolitical outlook if we have time here, but I'm going to go to Francois on greenhouse gas emissions, because it is a responsibility for governments to set the framework to contend with climate change, which is real. The Loss and Damage Fund now has a framework. We talked about the green finance support. Why are you so concerned, Francois? And then I'm going to go to Nathan.
No, the point is that Dr. Mohedin is perfectly right in announcing the efforts which have to be made and hopefully which will be made. But the point that there is an issue of urgency. Today, and this was of course discussed in COP28, today we know that we are more or less between 20 and 30% above target in terms of the reduction in emission. I mean, as a matter of fact, emissions have not been reduced, okay? And maybe 2023 will be the year with the top, or maybe 2024 will be the peak year in terms of emission. So this means that we are already late in the process of adjustment. And the more we wait, and the more difficult it will be at the time that we'll have to make the effort.
More expensive it gets, too, right?
And at the same time, the more we wait, and the more risk we are facing that some catastrophe will happen, that some tipping point in the global system will be reached with irreversible damage on the planet, on the climate. So this means that something has to be done urgently. And the point I would like to make in connection with our previous topic is the fact that it is very difficult to imagine that a big effort will be made to solve the climate change problem without this having an impact on economic growth. We have to realize that what we are talking about today is the replacement of a huge machinery which was producing a lot of goods, a lot of services, and was growing over time. We have to replace part of it by a new machinery. But in this replacement, the total output will not change much. It will change nature, and there will be definitely investment opportunities in order to accelerate and in order to make the replacement as effective as possible. But we have to face the fact that whatever we want to do, whatever the way we go, then there will be a big pressure on global growth, which will come from the fact that inevitably the price of carbon will go up, whether it will be through cap and trade, through taxes or through regulation in many countries, and this will have the negative impact on global growth. So we have to face this, and we must be prepared to address the social consequences of this kind of situation.
Yeah. Good. I always say the human species is not good at near-term planning. It's only when a pandemic hits do you rally to the cause, or medium-term planning is a challenge, right? Because we had the Rio Summit in 1992. Yeah. Not a lot happened in 3 decades, but now we're putting the throttle down. I think it'd be really good value added here, Nathan, if you can address Anthony Scaramucci was saying to His Excellency Abdullah bin Tuki, he didn't want to get into U.S. politics, but from an economic standpoint, how do you map it? Because there's a lot of uncertainty, age of both the candidates, rival relations Donald Trump had with the NATO countries, the European Union, tariffs across the board, challenging China. If I was sitting in the audience and I wanted to know what's next, what are you telling your clients, Nathan?
Yeah, let me just make a handful of comments here on the election, and specifically what it means from an economic, financial standpoint. I'd say my first point is, regardless of whether Trump or Biden wins this election, U.S. fiscal deficits and rising debt levels are likely to be with us for as far as the eye can see. In either scenario, the CBO projections, which expect U.S. budget deficits to be running at 5.5% to 6% of GDP, are the best baseline. And frankly, if you have a Republican sweep, that might mean more tax cuts and higher deficits and debt. And if you have a Democratic
that doesn't
sweep,
matter anymore, Nathan?
Well, for a long time, I would have said no. But for the first time in my career this past summer, markets woke up and said, look, there's a lot of debt. And the number one question I heard from clients during the second half of last year was, who's going to buy all this debt? And so I think that there is more of a risk that we could see challenges there. So fiscal is pretty much invariant. It's a sad story either way. The regulatory piece, which was touched on earlier, it's a very different approach, where Biden is going to continue with a vigorous regulatory agenda in energy and finance and consumers and labor, and Trump is going to vigorously deregulate. And I think that may be the biggest, in my mind, the biggest economic delta. And then finally, in terms of international economic policy, both Trump and Biden are going to be, quote unquote, tough on China. It'll come with a different accent and different tools. Perhaps Trump will be more tariff intensive, but either way, it's going to be a tough China policy.
So tariffs go on across the board, and is there enough resilience to resist? He's talking about 10%, Donald Trump, but particularly targeted at China.
The extent to which the system withstands those kinds of big shocks, I think, is an open issue. If we're talking about 10% across the board, that doesn't feel to me like a very anti-inflationary policy from the United States. And for that reason, I'm doubtful it would actually happen. but I think the system can probably withstand 10%. If you get in the world of 60% tariffs, like what Trump's talking about with China, that sounds like you break those supply chains entirely. What we're seeing now is a reprofiling of supply chains in a lot of different ways, and firms responding. 60% probably breaks it. Finally, the biggest delta, I think, in international economic policy between the two is on Europe, where Biden is a very classical transatlanticist and values that European alliance, whereas I think Trump is much more conflicted about the relationship with Europe. And notably, Madame Lagarde has already noted this, where she says that Donald Trump could pose challenges for Europe because of his views on tariffs, which we've mentioned,
and the Paris Agreement,
on NATO, on climate change, which we've talked about. It's going to be a very different tone in that transatlantic relationship between a Biden presidency versus a Trump presidency.
Good. I saw you nodding, Dr. Mahmoud, and I know that Francois has some thoughts. We have 4 minutes, so I'm going to give a minute each on these topics and then a summary topic.
Right. Super quickly, for countries of the global south that had benefited a great deal from globalization, from trade flows, from investments, and for technology transfer, I really hate it when I see a potential a trade war continuing. And it's not just about China. We need to realize that the center of economic gravity is shifting toward the east. And the east is not just China. It's India, it's Indonesia, Vietnam. So if we're going to pick a fight every time that you see a country with high growth, that's an endless game. A cooperative game will be beneficial to everyone, not just for the incumbent powers and the emerging ones, but for the rest of us. The issue of concern here, and going back perhaps to solutions, when we talk about the numbers and the figures, my concern today on the sustainability at large, not just on climate, on the SDGs, that only 15% of them are on track. 55% are deviating from target, and 35% are worse than where we were back in 2015 when we launched them, including climate, including extreme poverty, including inequality. So if we are going to celebrate short-term gains here and there without really missing education, health, infrastructure, we are missing a lot. This is one. But there are solutions. Invest, deal with debt, and more of technology transfers, and better depoliticized incentive structure, including the regulatory framework. For middle class, give them opportunities, education again, health, and definitely there could be, as it happens today in India, supporting another billion human being belonging now to the middle class rising. That could be really through more investment opportunities. And one area of interest for those who are interested in investments is the insurance sector that could provide opportunities for those who reach some sort of level of income and standard of living and worried about it. And
they're starving for guarantees, right? So they can unlock capital. I've heard this multiple times.
But we can talk about that because that had always been a neglected part, including in the finance for development, that insurance has never been taken seriously, the commercial part or the public one. And the overall public support globally for insurance, not just of companies or middle-income people or middle class, is for the system at large, which is basically the multilateral system, which is suffering. I celebrated the announcement of Altera, the 30 billion with its ambitions. But this is not a substitute to what we can be getting from the MDBs, like the World Bank and the others. What's so-called evolution roadmap, I see it a kind of an evolution roadmap for irrelevance, because without capital increase, without injection of more finance to the MDBs, they are not going to be helping the private sector or leveraging them. They are not going to be helping countries in need for de-risking.
Great. We're in our last minute, and I'd love to have, Francois, your views. The UAE prides itself on its neutrality and being a globalized economy. I know this region tries to tilt into the Eastern growth, but still maintaining relations with Europe and the US. Is that going to be very difficult for countries like the UAE if a Donald Trump comes in? and wants people to pick sides. And Nathan, can you give a final thought, and then we'll have to wrap. We're out of time, so be direct. Thanks.
Okay, it seems to me that it will be a difficult situation for any country in the world if Donald Trump is elected. So, fine. I mean, I believe that we have to hope that this will not happen.
We're asking for
is it okay that
the grand resilience. This will be the grand.
Okay.
Trump 2 would be the grand resilience.
Okay, we'll see whether we have this kind of resilience, but it is okay that it is possible that a lot of damage can be done by this kind of administration. Now, as far as the UAE is concerned, I believe that, as a matter of fact, maybe there would be less concerned about what will be the implication of such an election, basically because they rely on abundance, as it was said earlier, and this is, of course, a huge strength. And because of that, resilience is really something fantastic in the UAE, because given its very specific structure, it is able to adjust very quickly to any kind of a shock that is taking place. And partly this is due to the very flexible migration flow, which allow the country to immediately adjust in a rather without any pain for everybody to any shock. So I believe that UAE is really very much protected from the damage that may happen if this election is taking place.
Okay. Nathan, you got 30 seconds. Sorry about that, sir, but excellent conversation. We can go on for another 30 minutes easily because there's a lot of good content here.
We could. I think one of the realities we're seeing in the global economy right now is the contours of globalization are shifting. And I don't think it's a deglobalizing world. I think it is a rebalancing and reprofiling of that globalization. And consistent with that, if Donald Trump is elected, I think one of the key features that we're seeing is a move away from a China-centric kind of global economy into one where the benefits are much more evenly distributed across Asia, across the Middle East. I think we're seeing this in a huge way here today, in Mexico and in Latin America. So that the profiles of globalization are changing in a Trump administration. I don't think he's able to turn back those forces. I think the forces driving globalization are deep and about communication and about human desire to interact with each other and businesses' efforts to be more efficient. But it will shift it. And if anything, I think in that system, in that scenario, the Middle East is likely to continue to be a winner.
Interesting. Okay. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. You don't usually abide by my time structures, but we went for 30 minutes not talking about AI.
We have a 15 years of track record on that. Yeah. And you are resilient.
But I'd love to have you just address the middle income and the AI, because we see a lot of productivity coming out, a lot of excitement, embracement here at the UAE about the potential for it. But what's the risk for these middle income economies of the world? Can you do it in 30, please?
I'm seeing the opportunities of AI. I'm not in fear. I'm not concerned. Our countries of the global south do not really have this kind of legacy technology that are going to be taking ages for restructuring.
They can leapfrog.
Exactly. And many countries would leapfrog, as we said, will invest right. And in terms of preparedness, there are many countries that are investing adequately in their youth, which is basically very much required in engaging with the new technologies and what they offered. Many countries, including our host country, had seen it coming to the extent that they appointed a minister with a title, a Minister of Artificial Intelligence. So I'm here very much concerned about excessive regulation that could deny developing economies and emerging markets for the opportunities to get these technologies. Yes, we should be concerned about the ethical part, about the abuse, about all of these matters, but I shouldn't really be putting them as shields to prevent our countries from access to one of the main keys for progress and development going forward. And I don't think I'm speaking just for my opinion here, but for those who are of the younger population, our median age in this region in particular is less than 25 and 30. They are not in fear of that. If there are concerns, they could be addressed. The United Nations already is commissioning a group of intelligent, qualified, wise people to put adequate regulations, but then we need to unleash the potential of AI. It has great opportunities, especially for our countries in the region here.
Good. We have to find a common ground between the U.S. and China on that subject as well. Excellent panel. I really appreciate the mix of the people we have here. Dr. Modine, always a pleasure to see you. Nathan, it's the first time we met, but fantastic analysis. And Francois, always a pleasure to have you here with the bigger picture and some of the tensions that are out there. Can we give a nice round of applause to the panelists? And we look forward to the next session. Yeah, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.